Chapter 8 Ideal Society. It is an inspiring thought, and a true one, that in proportion as a man's interests become humane and his efforts rational, he appropriates and expands a communicable life, which reappears in all individuals who reach the same impersonal level of ideas. Patriotism envisages this ideal life insofar as it is locally colored and grounded in certain racial aptitudes and traditions, but the community recognized in patriotism is embedded in a larger one, embracing all living creatures. While in some respects we find sympathy more complete the nearer home we remain, in another sense there is no true companionship except with the universe. Instinctive society, with its compulsory affections, is of course deeper and more elementary than any free or intellectual union. Love is at once more animal than friendship and more divine. And the same thing may be said of family affection when compared with patriotism. What lies near the roots of our being must needs enjoy a wider prevalence and engage the soul more completely, being able to touch its depths and hush its primordial murmurs. On the other hand, the free spirit, the political and speculative genius of man, chafes under those blind involutions and material bonds, natural, beneficent, sacred, as in a sense they may be. They somehow oppress the intellect and, like a brooding mother, half stifle what they feed. Something drives the youth afield, into solitude, into alien friendships. Only in the face of nature and a different world can he become himself. Such a flight from home and all its pieties grows more urgent when there is some real conflict of temper or conscience between the young man and what is established in his family. And this happens often because, after all, the most beneficent conventions are but mechanisms which must ignore the nicer sensibilities and divergences of living souls. Common men accept these spiritual tyrannies. Weak men repine at them, and great men break them down. But to defy the world is a serious business, and requires the greatest courage, even if the defiance touch, in the first place, only the world's ideals. Most men's conscience, habits, and opinions are borrowed from convention, and gather continual comforting assurances from the same social consensus that originally suggested them. To reverse this process, to consult one's own experience, and elicit one's own judgment, challenging those in vogue, seems too often audacious and futile. But there are impetuous minds born to disregard the chances against them, even to the extent of denying that they are taking chances at all. For in the first instance, it never occurs to the inventor that he is the source of his new insight. He thinks he has merely opened his eyes and seen what, by an inconceivable folly, the whole world has grown blind to. Wise men in antiquity, he imagines, saw the facts as he sees them, as the gods see them now, and as all sane men shall see them henceforward. Thus, if the innovator be a religious soul, grown conscious of some new spiritual principle, he will try to find support for his inspiration in some lost book of the law, or in some early divine revelation corrupted, as he will assert, by wicked men, or even in some direct voice from heaven. No delusion will be too obvious, no reinterpretation too forced, if it can help him to find external support somewhere for his spontaneous conviction. To denounce one authority, he needs to invoke another, and if no other be found, he will invent, or as they say, he will postulate one. His courage in facing the actual world is thus supported by his ability to expand the world in imagination. In separating himself from his fellow men, he has made a new companion out of his ideal. An impetuous spirit, when betrayed by the world, will cry, "I know that my Redeemer liveth," and the antiphonal responds, will come more wistfully after reflection. It fortifies my soul to know that though I perish, truth is so. The deceptions which nature practices on men are not always cruel. These are also kindly deceptions, which prompt him to pursue or expect his own good when, though not destined to come in the form he looks for, this good is really destined to come in some shape or other. Such, for instance, are the illusions of romantic love, which may really terminate in a family life practically better than the absolute and chimerical unions which that love had dreamed of. Such, again, are the illusions of conscience, which attach unspeakable vague penalties and repugnances to acts which commonly have bad results, though these are impossible to forecast with precision. When disillusion comes, while it may bring a momentary shock, it ends by producing a settled satisfaction unknown before, a satisfaction which the coveted prize, could it have been attained, would hardly have secured. When on the day of judgment, or earlier, a man perceives that what he thought he was doing for the Lord's sake, he was really doing for the benefit of the least, perhaps, of the Lord's creatures, his satisfaction, after a moment's surprise, will certainly be very genuine. Ideal society belongs entirely to this realm of kindly illusion, for it is a society of symbols. Whenever religion, art, or science presents us with an image or a formula involving no matter how momentous a truth, there is something delusive in the representation. And yet, there is another aspect to the matter. Symbols are presences, and they are very particularly congenial presences which have inwardly evoked and cast in a form intelligible and familiar to human thinking. Their function is to give flat experience a rational perspective, translating the general flux into stable objects, and making it representable in human discourse. They are therefore precious, not only for their representative or practical value, implying useful adjustments to the environing world, but even more, sometimes, for their immediate or aesthetic power, for their kinship to the spirit they enlighten and exercise. This is prevailingly true in the fine arts, which seem to express man even more than they express nature, although in art also the symbol will lose all its significance, and much of its inward articulation, if natural objects and eventual experience could be disregarded in constructing it. In music, indeed, this ulterior significance is reduced to a minimum, yet it persists, since music brings an ideal object before the mind, which needs, to some extent, translation in terms no longer musical. Terms, for instance, of skill, dramatic passion, or moral sentiment. But in music, preeminently, and very largely, in all the arts, external propriety is adventitious. So much can the mere presence and weight of a symbol fill the mind and constitute an absolute possession. In religion and science, the overt purpose of symbols is to represent external truths. The inventors of these symbols think they are merely uncovering a self-existent reality, having in itself the very form seen in their idea. They do not perceive that the society of God or nature is an ideal society, nor that these phantoms, looming in their imagination, are but significant figments whose subjective basis is a minute and indefinite series of ordinary perceptions. They consequently attribute whatever value their genial synthesis may have to the object as they picture it. The gods have, they fancy, the aspect and passions, the history and influence which their myth unfolds. Nature, in its turn, contains hypostatically just those laws and forces which are described by theory. Consequently, the presence of God or nature seems to the mythologist not an ideal, but a real and mutual society, as if collateral beings, endowed with the conceived characters, actually existed as men exist. But this opinion is untenable, as Hobbes said, in a phrase which ought to be inscribed in golden letters over the head of every talking philosopher. No discourse whatsoever can end in absolute knowledge of fact. Absolute knowledge of fact is immediate. It is experiential. We should have to come up against God or nature as we imagine them in order to know for a fact that they existed. Intellectual knowledge, on the other hand, where it relates to hidden existence, is faith only, a faith which in these matters means trust. The divine and material are contrasted points of reference required by the actual. Reason, working on the immediate flux of appearances, reaches these ideal realms and resting in them, perforce calls them realities. One, the realm of causes, supplies appearances with a basis and calculable order. The other, the realm of truth and felicity, supplies them with a standard and justification. Natural society may accordingly be contrasted with ideal society, not because our idea of nature is not, logically speaking, ideal too, but because in natural society we ally ourselves consciously with our origins and surroundings, in ideal society with our thoughts. There is an immense difference in spirituality and ideality of the moral sort, between gathering and conciliating forces for action and fixing the ends which action should pursue. Both fields are ideal in the sense that intelligence alone could discover or exploit them. Yet to call nature ideal is undoubtedly equivocal, since its ideal function is precisely to be the substance and cause of the given flux, a groundwork for experience which, while merely inferred and potential, is nonetheless dynamic and material. The significance of the word nature is indeed of such a sort to be fortified if the trusty instrument and true antecedent of human life were not found there. We should be frivolous and inconstant, taking our philosophy for a game and not for method in living. If having set out to look for the causes and practical order of things, and having found them, we should declare that they were not really casual or efficient, on the strange ground that they were not, that our discovery of them had been a feat of intelligence and had proved a priceless boon. The absurdity could not be greater if in moral science, after the goal of all agitation had been determined and defined, we declare that this was not really the good. Those who were shocked at the assertion that God and nature are ideal, and that their contrasted prerogatives depend on that fact, may, of course, use the same words in a different way, making them synonymous, and may readily prove that God or nature exists materially and has absolute being. We need but agree to designate by those terms the sum of existences, whatever they or it may be on their own account. Then ontological proof asserts its rights unmistakably. Science and religion, however, are superfluous if we wish to learn that there is something, and that all there is must assuredly be all there is. Ecstasies may doubtless ensue upon considering that being is and non-being is not, and they are said to ensue upon long enough considering one's navel. But the life of reason is made of more variegated stuff. Science, when it is not dialectical, describes an ideal order of existences in space and time, such that all incidental facts, as they come, may fill it in and lend it body. Religion, when pure, contemplates some pertinent ideal of intelligence and goodness. Both religion and science live in imaginative discourse, one being aspiration and the other hypothesis, both introduced into the mind an ideal society. The life of reason is no fair reproduction of the universe, but the expression of man alone. A theory of nature is nothing but a mass of observations made with a hunter's and an artist's eye. A mortal, in order to live, must devour one half of the world and disregard the other. So in order to think and practically know, he must deal summarily and selfishly with his materials. Otherwise his intellect would melt again into endless and irrecoverable dreams. The law of gravity, because it so notably unifies the motions of matter, is something which these motions themselves know nothing of. It is a description of them in terms of human discourse. Such discourse can never assure us absolutely that the motions it forecasts will occur. The sensible proof must ensue spontaneously in its own good time. In the interval, our theory remains pure presumption and hypothesis. Reliable as it may be in that capacity, it is no replica of anything of its own character existing beyond. It creates, like all intelligence, a secondary and merely symbolic world. When this diversity between the truest theory and the simplest fact, between potential generalities and actual particulars, has been thoroughly appreciated, it becomes clear that much of what is valued in science and religion is not lodged in the miscellany underlying these creatures of reason, but is lodged rather in the rational activity itself, and in the intrinsic beauty of all symbols bred in a genial mind. Of course, if these symbols had no real points of reference, if they were symbols of nothing, they could have no great claim to consideration, and no rational character. At most they would be agreeable sensations. They are, however, at their best, good symbols for a diffused order and tendency in events. They render that reality with difference, reducing it to a formula or a myth in which its tortuous length and trivial detail can be surveyed to advantage without undue waste or fatigue. Symbols may thus become eloquent, vivid, important, being endowed with both poetic grandeur and practical truth. The facts from which this truth is borrowed, if they are rehearsed unimaginatively in their own flat infinity, will be far from arousing the same emotions. The human eye sees in perspective. Its glory would vanish were it reduced to a crawling, exploring antenna. Not that it loves to falsify anything, that to the worm the landscape might possess no light and shade, that the mountain's atomic structure should be unpicturable, cannot distress the landscape gardener nor the poet. What concerns them is the effect such things may produce in the human fancy, that the soul may live in a congenial world. Naturalist and prophet are landscape painters on canvases of their own. Each is interested in his own perception and perspective, which, if he takes the trouble to reflect, need not deceive him about what the world would be if not foreshortened in that particular manner. This special interpretation is nevertheless precious, and shows up the world in that light which it interests naturalists or prophets to see it. Their figments make their chosen world, as the painters have perceptions, are the life of his works. While the symbol's applicability is essential to its worth, since otherwise science would be useless and religion demoralizing. Its power and fascination lie in its acquiring a more and more profound affinity to the human mind, so long as it can do so without surrendering its relevance to practice. Thus, natural science is at its best when it is most thoroughly mathematical, since what can be expressed mathematically can speak a human language. In such science only the ultimate material elements remain surds. All their further movement and complication can be represented in that kind of thought which is most intimately satisfactory and perspicuous. And in like manner, religion is at its best when it is most anthropomorphic. Indeed, the two most spiritual religions, Buddhism and Christianity, have actually raised a man, overflowing with utterly human tenderness and pathos, to the place usually occupied only by cosmic and thundering deities. The human heart is lifted above misfortune and encouraged to pursue unswervingly its inmost ideal. when no compromise is any longer attempted with what is not moral or human, and Prometheus is honestly proclaimed to be holier than Zeus. At that moment, religion ceases to be superstitious and becomes a rational discipline, an effort to perfect the spirit rather than to intimidate it. We have seen that society has three stages: the natural, the free, and the ideal. In the natural stage, his function is to reduce the individual and equip him with the prerequisites of moral freedom. When this end is attained, society can rise to friendship, to unanimity, to some ideal interest. While this association constitutes, at the same time, a personal and emotional bond. Ideal society, on the contrary, transcends accidental conjunctions altogether. Here the ideal interests themselves take possession of the mind. Its companions are the symbols it breeds and possesses for excellence, beauty, and truth. Religion, art, and science are the chief spheres in which ideal companionship is found. It remains for us to traverse these provinces in turn and see to what extent the life of reason may flourish there.